Everyone, welcome back to Getting In, a college coach conversation. We've got a lot to talk about in this segment. I don't know if we have enough time, but we're going to do our very best to stay on point and not over discuss. If
Right.
you're watching us on video, you'll already have noticed that Kira Tyler is back to talk about the SCOTUS decision. I want to point folks to our archives because you had a great conversation, Kira, with Sally when this decision initially came out back in early July. And I think if you have not listened to that episode, it was a great one. And it's worth going back
Thanks,
and hearing a little bit from what Kira and Sally had to share. So I recommend doing that.
Thank you.
Thank you for your perspective. So just to update folks, if you've been living under a rock somewhere, SCOTUS decided that they wanted to basically strike down affirmative action and eliminate race-conscious admissions. And now we live in a world of race-neutral admissions.
Yeah.
Kira, I think that there are like different groups of folks who are affected by this. There are individual applicants, there are colleges, there are admission officers. I wanted to start with some data I found from Inside Higher Ed that I thought was interesting. And I'm just going to read this quote from the article. More than half of admissions officers said they think the affirmative action decision will result in fewer minority students being admitted to competitive institutions. At the same time, 3/4 believe their own institution will maintain its current level of diversity despite the Supreme Court's decision. I thought this was very dissonant for me. It was sort of like, well, our school is going to be good, but I think in general, we're going to have less diversity. How do you unpack that? How do you think about that perspective?
Sure. So if I think about the kind of people who do admission work, like you and I have in the past, and we're still connected to that work, we have a lot of deep respect for those folks that are doing it currently, that we are optimistic, right? Like we're sort of mission driven, I think. And so what we see is that the past has told us that when states have gotten rid of affirmative action or the Supreme Court actually used race based as opposed to race conscious, which I think is interesting. Um, so when that has been abolished, that we see that there are fewer applicants, right? And there are obviously fewer people who are admitted. But I think what you see from their perspective is that they're a hopeful group and they believe that they can come up with some creative solutions and their institutions will support them in doing so and they will be able to overcome that. I think that's what's going on.
There was, in the wake of the initial decision, I imagine you saw this across your social media. I saw it all over LinkedIn. Admissions officers saying, we will do everything we can to continue to preserve diversity. I found it to be very striking and interesting in contrast to data around the American public who kind of support the decision on the whole. And there is some, I want to kind of explain, like, what does race conscious admissions mean? Not race based, right? And you're right to call out that distinction. What do you think accounts for that discrepancy? I mean, this is one of those scenarios where folks say, I'm not really in favor of affirmative action, but the people who are doing the work, who are in the profession, see it as an essential part of maintaining diversity at institutions.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that in some ways, this is like part of a much bigger conversation around the foundation of things that we have known, right? Dobbs, that we have known that have suddenly people have decided we don't want to do that anymore for whatever reason. And so I think that the American public believes, to some extent, believes the hype. We're done. We had a black president. Here we are. We're this, we're that. And they don't fully understand the policy, which was as a factor, not the reason.
Right.
And I think people believe we've moved on. There are other things to talk about. They're right. There are a lot of other things to talk about, for better or for worse, but we have not moved on. But it's a little bit of a complex thing to hold in your head. And I don't know that everybody's up for that, interested in it, that it fits their values.
Yeah. The work of admitting a diverse class is really challenging.
Yes.
It was challenging before. It will be even more challenging now.
Yes.
One of the things that's really interesting about admission is the inherent selfishness of it, right? Which is like, I want diversity at the institution I want to go to, but I also want to be admitted to that institution, right? So I need my advantage to be maximized, but I also want to see certain kinds of experiences waiting for me when I get there.
Mhm.
And that to me is a little bit of that contrast where folks are like, I don't think I like affirmative action because it might affect my situation or my kid.
Mhm. Mhm.
And admission officers are looking at it from the perspective of the institution and the overall wellness of the institution and understanding how important this piece is. Have you gotten any questions from individuals? Have you seen the impact on an individual level in the last 3 months of folks who are curious how this will affect them,
Totally.
concerned at how this will affect them? Like, what has
Mm.
been the nature of just your kid on the streets understanding of this process
Yeah.
in your experience?
Sure. I've gotten a lot of questions about this, and kids of all stripes, right? Black kids, white kids, Asian kids, Latino kids, like, they're curious. I think there's a little bit of hesitancy to ask the question
Yeah,
because I think people don't want you to think that if they ask the question that they feel a certain kind of way about it. I'd rather people ask the question and we can talk about it than
sure.
not ask the question, but I do think there's a lot of curiosity about it. Um, I will also say though, Ian, that I have been struck by the amount of kids who kind of also don't know anything about it. And
True.
I'm blown away by that.
It's true.
I mean, if I put myself back in my high school self, I was super politically engaged. Also, this is I have never revealed this publicly. I wrote my college essay about affirmative action crumbling in California.
Wow.
I think it was Prop 209, right, when I applied to college. So, like, I am acutely aware. I have been thinking about this for a really long time. But, yes, kids are really curious, and the underpinning question is always like, "Well, how is this gonna affect me? Will I be able to get into this school now? Will I have a better shot?" Or, like, I don't know, d what should I say in the application? And these are great questions, and I get why people are concerned and curious.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense, and I do
Yes.
think that how does this affect me is the right question to ask, especially in the context of the conversations that you and I have. Right? We
Yes.
talk to a family, we're talking to them about a college admission.
Mhm.
It is important for them to be able to put their best foot forward.
Yes.
I also think that, one of the things that we can't necessarily answer is how does this affect the institutions? What is the process and the pace at which things will change at those institutions if they change at all?
Right.
What are we still have not had a round of admission in
Right.
this new landscape. And so it's very hard to know what things are going to look like when
Yeah.
admission statistics are released in the spring. Do you
And
hear
I
any? Yeah,
Yeah.
please.
Well, I was just gonna say that I think that for me has been one of the most challenging parts of this is that I'm comfortable, like, with some of the things that I don't know, but truly, this is like a big question mark, and I'm just not sure. My cynical side relies on the data that we've seen before, which is that, "Oh my gosh, it's all falling down." But then my reasonable self says, "Yeah, but Kira, it's for not as many schools as people probably think it is. It doesn't really impact," right? And so I'm sort of like of the I love December for a lot of reasons, but because that's like our first slice of data,
Yeah.
right? It's
Yeah.
good. And then obviously what falls out, what drips out until April 1. So I think this is going to be interesting, but I don't really think we're going to really get a good feel for it until next year's cycle.
I think you're right. And that's one of the things just about education in general is that whenever you introduce a stimulus, whether it's in a classroom, whether
Yes,
it's an admissions process, you have
right.
to wait to see what the impact of that thing is going to be. And the frustrating thing about this is that you could look at California and see all of the effects that this had there when they removed race from their admission process and the deep work that they have had to do in order to get back to a level of diversity that they had been in
Yeah,
before. So there is evidence out there. UC is its own system, but I think it's a good cross section of America and perhaps a helpful case study for us to look
yeah.
at.
And deep work, like deep knowledge, deep dive, like real experts and also very deep pockets, right?
Deep
So
pockets,
this
yeah,
is
yeah,
a very big undertaking. I will say now, this is a small anecdotal sample, but of some of the students that I work with, I've been surprised that like some of the same schools, and these are kids that go to very well resourced high schools, um, which is its own 4-hour conversation of a well resourced high school, but they still have the same players coming to their schools. And I'm sort of
yeah.
like, but guys, I thought we were going to do something different maybe around recruitment. I thought we were going to be thinking about, zip codes and like, schools that don't have physics right? Schools that don't have like let's and I haven't really again, small sample, but I've been sort of surprised that requires planning. And I sort of thought people were thinking about that and able to make some of those changes around recruitment. Because I think that is one big way we get our way out of this, move
Yeah.
forward. And so that I think has been to me surprising. They could be working with CBOs. I don't know every admission officer's schedule, but I do know that they're still making time for some of those massive heavy hitting schools.
Yeah, you're right. And, I think you've said like 9 things that I want to go in 9 different directions right now. I do want to applaud Caltech. There have been some really great articles that have come out about the work that
Yes.
Caltech has been doing to continue to admit a diverse class and to understand context really, really well. So they've done some
Yes.
awesome stuff, and you can find great articles about the work that they've been doing.
Right.
Um, there has been, I wouldn't say a backlash, Kira, but there has been some response around, okay, well, affirmative action is gone. What about legacy? What about the other ways in which the admission process advantages other groups?
Right.
Can colleges make changes in this way? And while you've seen that in op-eds, and you've seen some schools that have eliminated legacy, Virginia Tech comes to mind as an example of a
Right.
school that said, we're getting rid of
Amherst.
this.
Yep.
Amherst got rid of it.
Wesleyan.
Wesleyan got rid of it. Most schools are kind of silent on it. A lot of institutions themselves are not saying, okay, we're going to level the playing field for all. They're leveling the playing field according to what they've been legally required to do. And whether
Right.
that's leveling at all, we can debate, right? And I don't think we'll debate it much. But what's going on there, and what has been your perception of like this conversation around legacy and this conversation about advantage showing up in
hmm
other ways too?
Yeah, because if I put my fundraising hat on, I worked in development, not for long because I didn't love it. Um, if I put that hat back on, the reason why places that are really pushing this idea correctly about, you know, affirmative action, race conscious admissions, building a diverse class, all of those things, wanting to still commit to those ideals, that when you poke away and you say to your alums, I don't think we're going to do it anymore, that then threatens fundraising dollars, that threatens alumni engagement. It could potentially threaten apps, right?
Yeah.
So I think it really chips away at potentially endowed scholarships, athletics, study abroad programs that are beautifully funded by a lot of alums. Like, I think that's why it then gets to be money. Also, the complicated part is that for some of these schools that offer robust financial aid and scholarship opportunities that are not loan based or just really generous, it happens because of a hefty donor class.
Yeah, significant endowment and continuing to fill that endowment.
Yes.
And so I have not been surprised that some of the bigger names have not taken action on legacy conversation because that's a big institutional priority for them.
Yep.
And I think, if we're waiting to see like that fairness come on the part of them that they're going to take the initiative, I think we should not hold our breaths.
Agreed.
Schools have made some changes within admissions offices, and I think you're seeing this at different levels of selectivity, but with respect to the essay question.
hmm
And a lot of schools have introduced a version of an identity essay question, partly because in the majority opinion, Chief Justice Roberts said something about colleges being able to ask students about their lived experiences and how they might intersect with race and how that has impacted the life that they've led.
Sure.
So some schools have taken him literally. In fact, Sarah Lawrence took him
Yes.
literally. They quoted him
I
and
love
they
that.
said, respond to this. How has your life been impacted
Yeah.
in some ways based on your race? But other
Yeah.
schools
And
have
it's
been a little
not
more,
optional, right?
it's not
It's not
optional.
a that's not optional, right? It's
These are
mandatory.
not optional essays.
I
No,
love
that
this.
one's not.
Yes.
Yeah.
hmm
And so this identity essay is now something that students of color are encountering. And I think probably they've had many conversations about this over their lifetimes. It's also
Sure.
something that students who have never had to pause and think about their identity are now having to do, which has been interesting.
Yes.
As you've been working with students and talking about these essays, which, as you point out, are required to apply to these
Yeah.
schools, what's been going on with students? How have they been reacting and responding to this?
I think that for particular pockets of students, it's very challenging. Um, I will say I went to Guiding the Way to Inclusion. It's a conference that is put on by NACAC, which is the professional organization of admission counselors, and school counselors. And there was this whole like workshop or keynote on identity. And one of the really interesting things that I never realized, because I am very clear about my own identity, is that white people by and large do not understand their own identity. They are uncomfortable identifying themselves. And so I think I have definitely seen that bubble up a little bit, that with some of my white students, it takes us a little bit longer to get there because they're not sure. They sort of feel like, "W I don't know what my identity is." I think in all truth, right? Which isn't true. Everybody has an identity. But
100%.
so I love that these questions are being asked. I think they're really important. I think it will be a great way to get a better uh, lens on who the class is, how they're feeling, how they can communicate. And so I love that these questions are being asked. They're hard, but they're worth it.
They are hard. They're worth it.
Yeah.
As a white person, I've
Yes.
had workshops like these where we talk about inclusion. And initially, when they ask questions like, what is your identity? I don't lead with white. I don't typically lead with male, right? I
Yes.
lead with interests. I lead with because I can, because in that
Exactly.
context, it's very easy for me to ignore these aspects of my identity.
Right.
Whereas people of color often they have their race can be the most salient piece of their identity in certain contexts that they
Right.
might feel very strongly.
Yeah.
And so I think it's been hard for white students to say, where do I start with this question? How do I think about it? Am I answering this in the right kind of way? And I do appreciate that folks are having to have that reflective engagement because it gets easier over
Yeah.
time. If you continue to ask those questions of yourself,
It does.
you start to, it gets easier and you start to understand why it's important.
It does. And listen, I always identify because I think that that's like, it's obvious about me. Guess what, Ian? It's also obvious about you. You
It
are a
is.
white man. So
Right.
this idea that like we're like, well, I'm 6'2" and I have glasses and dark hair. It's like, that's not telling me anything. I don't know what that means.
Right.
So I think that to create more fluency around it, I love that this question is being asked. When I told this is when my daughter was really young, one of her teachers, I said, look, if you're not talking about like if my kid has to talk about race, like don't admonish her for like talking about it with her little, third grade friends. Like we're all going to talk about who aren't people of color. Like we're all going to talk about it. And I love that this question is a way to sort of kick that off.
That's right. And it has been something that not every school has introduced this.
Right.
I would say fewer than I expected. I have,
Me too.
it's been out there,
Me
but not as many
too.
as I thought.
Same. What do you think happened?
I think admission offices are slow to change,
Mm,
although they had plenty of warning that this was coming. And so
agreed.
I would have liked them to be prepared to ask these
Agreed.
questions. I think admission officers also engage in a lot of groupthink. And so there's some elements of like, what are other people going to do here before we change something this year? So I imagine
Totally.
that there might be more who try
Yeah.
something next year
Right.
and in the years to come. I don't know. It's a little disappointing. Like I feel like
I
there was
agree.
space to do more, but
Same. I think it's a question that puts your values front and center. So maybe people weren't ready for that. Right.
maybe
But I like to think that they were. I don't know.
you hope that they would be. In any
Yeah.
case, we got to end it here. I know we've got so much more to talk about, Kira, but uh, we're going to
Do.
talk. We got another segment to do. So
Okay.
let's come on back. We'll get you back here when we start
Thanks,
to see
Ian.
those first cross sections of data come through. And as we
Yeah.
learn a little bit more about this decision and how it's impacting all students, right? So this is not just impacting students of color, it's also impacting white students who have to write new essays now. So
Yes. This is
it's
an
important to say
everybody
something.
issue. It's an everybody issue.
Absolutely. Great. Always a pleasure, Kira. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Ian. Same.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye. Folks, we will be right back with a little bit more from Getting In.